Okay, so it's 7:03, so I'm going to get started. So hi everyone, and thanks everyone for coming. My name is Paul Ligeti, and I am the president of the Historical Society of West Windsor. Hopefully you're all here to learn about Edinburg, which is one of West Windsor's oldest historic communities. Now, this lecture is going to be about 50 minutes, 45 to 50 minutes long, and it's going to be, per usual, is going to be followed by a question and answer session. However, until we get to the end, if you haven't yet muted your microphones, if you're able to do so, that would be very helpful. So thank you. So now a quick note about the Historical Society. We are an all-volunteer nonprofit. We were founded in 1983, so 41 years ago, and we're composed of your friends and neighbors. Our nonprofit runs the West Windsor History Museum off of Southfield Road, and we have several historic farm buildings to explore. And if you haven't done so yet, I would encourage you to come visit us during our regular open houses, including our upcoming one this upcoming Saturday and Sunday from 1 to 4 p.m., both days. The Historical Society benefits the community in many ways, from free public events to student scholarships, history tours, lectures like this one, preservation initiatives, and much more. However, we simply can't do all of this without community support, so please consider donating or volunteering. To donate, and especially since we have a winter fundraiser going on right now, it's an end of the year fundraiser. You can just go to the link at the bottom of most of this presentation slides, including this one. Many of the Historical Society's activities honestly cost our nonprofit money, and we rely almost entirely on private donations to operate. So if you care about local history and community, please consider donating. None of our volunteers, including myself, are paid, so 100% of contributions go directly to the nonprofit. In addition to donating, you can also volunteer. Volunteering is open to all neighbors, including adults and students in 8th grade and above. There are many opportunities from museum tour guides to lectures to preservation initiatives, archiving, publicity, fundraising, and more. And again, the volunteer sign-up link is at the bottom of most of this lecture slides. Now, in 2022, we published a full-length township history book. It explores West Windsor's entire history from the Ice Age to the present day. You can buy it at the link highlighted on the screen, which is also at the end of the lecture. You can also get a copy at one of our museum open houses. The book does explore Edinburg very briefly, but of course, this lecture is going to be a lot more detailed. In addition to this, the Historical Society has also begun to install cast metal history markers around town. They are American made, they're very high quality and designed to last literally decades with little maintenance. And each marker highlights the history and significance of local sites and villages, including Edinburg, and we would like to have more up in the coming years. However, because of how high quality they are also naturally relatively expensive. So again, if you want to see more history markers around town and more preservation initiatives, then once again, please consider donating. Finally, one last note before we explore Edinburg. As I mentioned, the final West Windsor History Museum open house of 2024 is this upcoming Saturday and Sunday from 1 to 4 p.m. each day. This is what we call our annual, the flyer says winter open house, but we also annually call it our holiday open house. In addition to exploring historic buildings, attendees can bring their kids to meet Santa both days, listen to a story time at 1 p.m., enjoy holiday songs such as carols, Hanukkah songs, the Sanskrit songs in Sanskrit and more from 2 to 3 p.m. And even if you don't have kids, it's still very enjoyable to explore the museum, learn about the history of the property, and learn about West Windsor history. Per usual, admission is also free. But for now, finally, we can dive into Edinburgh's history. So now I want to start off with a question, which is what exactly is Edinburgh? And to some extent, it depends on who you talk to and when you talk to them, because most people today think of Edinburgh as the handful of buildings immediately surrounding the intersection pictured here, which is the intersection of Edinburg Road, Old Trenton Road, and Windsor Road. However, if you were to talk to someone back in the 1700s and 1800s, they would describe Edinburgh certainly as this crossroads, but also a much larger region that included a lot of the surrounding farms. Because of this, in this lecture, I'm not just going to cover the crossroads. I'm going to certainly do that, but I'm also going to cover the broader landscape. However, because I'll be detailing centuries of history of an entire community in roughly 50 minutes, it's going to be impossible for me to go in depth into every single building and every single person who lived there. So if I, don't talk about, someone you knew growing up or the old barn down the road or something else, that's a large reason of that is just because of the time constraint. That being said, there is, again, a question and answer period at the end of this lecture, and I'm happy to stay for any time to discuss anything or reminisce about anything. So probably the best way to begin with Edinburgh is to begin with its original settlers. These were also West Windsor's first settlers. So they were called the Lenni Lenape. They were a Native American society who arrived here thousands of years ago, likely around the end of the last ice age. Their territory included all of New Jersey and much of the surrounding states. Now, the Lenape were not one cohesive society. Instead, they were composed of numerous independent tribes, each with distinct histories and cultures. The Lenape traditionally lived in dispersed villages and maintained tribal territory cooperatively. Chiefs and a council of elders held substantial authority, but were still subject to the tribe's collective will. Men hunted, fished, cleared land, and defended the tribe, while women farmed, gathered fruit and nuts, constructed houses and furniture, raised children, made clothing, and cooked meals. Interestingly enough, unlike a European society, typically, historically, children actually belonged to their mother's clan in the Lenape, and leadership was similarly passed through the mother's line. The Lenape were also known as peacekeepers, preferring negotiation over war, but they certainly defended themselves if necessary. Now, the Lenape tribe that lived in central New Jersey were called the Assunpinks, a name roughly translating to a rocky or watery place, which is obviously a reference to the creek itself. And this is why the creek that runs through Edinburgh is still called the Assunpink Creek. And even the village of Edinburgh itself was originally called Assunpink when it was first settled. Although the Lenape were driven out by colonists by the early 1700s, which I have a whole nother lecture about, there have been numerous artifacts such as arrowheads and pottery still found in the Edinburgh area. In fact, there's been so much found in the area that it's believed that Edinburgh specifically was for some time before colonial settlement, a Lenape settlement. We don't know exactly the years when, but there's a significant amount of evidence for that. Now, again, here's a view of the Assunpink Creek as viewed from Old Trenton Road, very near to the Edinburg Crossroads. And again, its name references the original Native Americans who lived here for thousands of years. Now, we can mark the 1690s as the time that colonists began to settle the area. In that decade, wealthy British proprietors began to purchase immense tracts of land, and I'm going to show a map about it. And sometimes these tracts of land were about several thousand acres each. Now, most of these proprietors were absentee landowners that never set foot in the West Windsor area. There were names such as William Penn, who a lot of you know as the founder of Pennsylvania. Another one is David Lyle, and both Penn and Lyle are remembered via the naming of Penn-Lyle Road. However, some of the original proprietors actually did settle in the area as far back as the 1690s. This includes families such as the Bainbridges, the Grooms, and the Tyndalls. In fact, on the next slide, I'm going to highlight again the map of this original land acquisition in the 1690s, and then later on in the 1730s. So that's when the families such as the Rogers, Hutchinsons, Cubberleys, Hoopers, and more began to arrive. So again, here we see a map of land ownership in southern West Windsor in the 1690s. Again, note the pink star, which is roughly right around here in the center of the screen. And that shows the current Edinburg Crossroads. You're also going to notice, again, names like William Penn up in the very top center, David Lyle, Andrew Hamilton, and more, who again were some of those absentee landowners. Kind of in the left side, kind of centered, you see Hapa Hakona and Toloman selling land to David Lyle in 1703. And then also interestingly, this blue tract here that says John Bainbridge and Peter Groom, just south of the Assunpink Creek, is the property that I was referencing that had a house dating as far back as the 1690s. Actually, two deeds from both from 1693 and from 1696 specifically mention a house on the tract. And this is our earliest evidence of there being any kind of colonial house in Edinburg or in West Windsor in general. So again, you can see all of this land ownership and how large the tracts were back then, taking up sometimes several hundred acres each, sometimes taking up several thousand acres each. In contrast, this is a map of land ownership in southern West in the area in the mid 1700s, around which time Edinburgh began to form as a community centered around the Crossroads, where the Blue Star is within Clement Hooper's old tract. You probably also noticed familiar family names such as the Hutchinsons, Tyndalls, Rogers, Hoopers, Combs, and others. These are some of Edinburgh's oldest families. Most of them arrived in Edinburgh in the mid 1700s, which, with the exception of the Tyndalls, who came earlier. And if I go back to the previous slide, you can see Thomas Tyndall mentioned here. We believe the outline of his tract was roughly this tract owned by William Tyndall in the center, but we're not quite clear on that because we don't have a deed exactly for Thomas Tyndall when he acquired the property. But he certainly lived in the area, even if not directly in West Windsor. He certainly lived nearby by the early 1700s. He passed away in 1712, and his family, the Tyndalls, owned this general area certainly by the time that he died, so the early 1700s. So again, you start to see other names start to settle the area. In the mid 1700s, again, you have the Hutchinsons, the Rogers, the Updikes, the Hoopers, the Robins, the Combs, and a few others. So now if we go into the next slide, another question is why did all of these families begin to settle the area? Well, it largely boils down to agriculture. West Windsor has a lot of fertile and well-drained soil and access to convenient waterways, meaning that settlers could establish immense farms stretching to the horizon in every direction. Now, this image, admittedly, that I generated it with AI, but it is probably something similar to what the general landscape might have looked like, starting in the mid 1700s and continuing well into the 20th century. For the rest of this presentation, you can keep this image in the back of your mind because this kind of boundless farming landscape was Edinburgh's context for centuries. Now, regrettably, this agricultural dominance also incentivized the institution of slavery. The Historical Society has numerous records such as newspaper ads, bills of sale, manumissions, and a lot more documents that prove and kind of quantify the existence of slavery in town. For instance, a census from 1790 showed there being about 190 slaves in town, which was about 7% of the town's overall population at the time. Now, most farms didn't actually have slaves, but those that did had about one or two slaves. However, we do know that some had up to 15. Now, these numbers did, of course, decline over the decades, but it really wasn't until the 1860s, effectively with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, that slavery fully disappeared in West Windsor. So regrettably, slavery was very much a fact of life in Edinburgh and in West Windsor overall. Now, back in the mid 1700s, when Assunpink, which again was the original name of Edinburgh, started to develop as a community around the Crossroads, West Windsor Township did not exist. Instead, this area was part of a much larger municipality called Windsor Township, pictured here. As you can see, Windsor Township had contained all of West Windsor, all of East Windsor, all of Robbinsville, all of Hightstown, and portions of Millstone, Monroe, and Princeton townships. Back then, these municipalities wouldn't form into their current configurations until much later. Back then, there were dozens of isolated villages that began to develop over the years, and each of them were separated by a sea of farmland. Specifically in the West Windsor area, this included places like Clarksville, Dutch Neck, Grover's Mill, Penn's Neck, and of course Assunpink, again, Edinburg, where this yellow star is in the map. And because of its central location in Windsor Township, Assunpink was also a popular site for town meetings until Windsor Township divided in 1797 into East Windsor and West Windsor. So now, why exactly did Assunpink develop in this exact location? At least part of the reason was that in 1754, a highway was surveyed to connect the village of Princeton and Allentown, and that is exactly where the highway crossed over the Assunpink Creek. Around the same time was when Windsor Road was surveyed, and Old Trenton Road. We don't have records dating back that far, quite that far, but it was also probably a small private road in the area around the time. As a result, it was this nexus of these roads and the Assunpink Creek. It became an ideal stop to become a stagecoach stop and generally to live in the area. Now, in the broader landscape, there are several houses that date to this 1700s era settlement that still stand. The most well-known is the John Rogers House in Mercer County Park. This is an old picture from the 70s, I believe, of the house. It features a unique brick pattern and even has its original owner's initials laid out in a brick pattern near the roof line. And the house was built in 1751 or 1761 by the Rogers family, who owned it until the early 1900s, after which it passed to a few other families. Now, in the 1970s, the John Rogers house was sold to the county. At the same time, it was also the county was buying up the surrounding farmland and turning it into Mercer County Park. And in 1978, the property, meaning the John Rogers house, was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. However, despite its historical significance, unfortunately, the county led to decay over the next several decades, and it was only really recently that any significant preservation efforts were undertaken. But by that point, all that was salvageable were the brick walls that you can see here. Now, to this day, the structure stands as an open-air ruin, surrounded by a few interpretive kiosks. However, there is a similar house in much better shape, partly because it's still used as a private residence. Located at 66 Line Road, this is the Isaac Hutchinson homestead. Tax records say it was built around 1785, and this is one of three Hutchinson family houses built in the mid to late 1700s in the immediate area. Again, the Hutchinsons are another one of the Assunpink's area's earliest settlers, and members of the Hutchinson family still live in the area. Another one of the original Hutchinson farms that is people probably know better today as the Tyndall Farm is right across from the Mercer County Community College. An old deed from 1786 mentions this, literally names it as being the Hutchinson family homestead. And this was apparently in the center of Jonathan Hutchinson's original estate when he purchased several hundred acres of land in 1737 and brought the Hutchinsons to the immediate area. Although the house that stands today mainly dates to the 1800s, there may be an 18th century core, and the Tyndalls have lived there for well over a century, and it's still one of West Windsor's largest farms. Another property that's probably from the 1700s is the Amos Tyndall homestead, right across the road from Mercer County Park. I'm highlighting this house because it's been continuously owned by the Tyndalls. Maybe, I don't know about recent years, but until at least recent years, it was continuously owned by the Tyndalls ever since it was built. In the mid-1800s, its owner was Amos Tyndall, who operated a distillery near the property. This was part, again, of a much larger Tyndall estate that was several hundred acres that, again, Thomas Tyndall probably bought back in the 1690s or very early 1700s. Some of the people on this Zoom session might recognize it more as either Russell Tyndall's farm or Earl Tyndall's farm even more recently. Now, there is another unique house at the Edinburg Crossroads. This is the Ivans Hill Mountain House, what the Historical Society calls the Ivans Hill Mountain House after some of its owners. But some of you may just call it the Mount House. I'm highlighting it partly due to its age, because according to township tax records, which admittedly may be tax records are often inaccurate, but sometimes they're accurate. This may date to the 1740s. If so, then it may be West Windsor's very oldest existing building. And it was presumably, if it does date to the 1740s, then it was presumably built by William Tyndall, who purchased the land in 1738. However, William probably didn't live here because he had a larger estate on Robbinsville Road. So we don't exactly know who the Blue House's original inhabitants were, but it was definitely owned by the Hill family in the 1800s. And of course, it's been owned by the Mount family for many more decades. So despite its relatively simple appearance, it does carry historical significance. Now, right next door at 1721 Old Trenton Road is the Sally Tanham House. It may have been built as early as the 1750s, according to other township records, and one record even claims it was originally a series of small barns that were later joined together. Now, I don't know how apocryphal this is or not, but it's certainly possible. In the early 1800s, it was owned by James Hutchinson, who built the general store across the street, what we now know today as the Village Pantry, which we're certainly going to be talking about. And a deed from 1888 lists the Sally Tanham House as a tenant lot, and the Blue House next door, again, the Ivans Hill Mount House, as the homestead lot, showing that the two houses were closely related. Now, in 1947, the Sally family sold this to Myron and Bernice Tanham, and the Tanhams lived there until about 20 years ago. The photo on the left with this guy named Henry Chamberlain in the motorcycle is probably from about the 1920s. And it's kind of hard to tell in this photo, but the house is actually much closer to the road. And it was probably moved a little bit further back from the road about 90 to 100 years ago. Now, there are a number of buildings that no longer exist, but still had historical significance. And one of the most important and one of the most interesting ones was this building here. Again, this is obviously an AI generated image. And this was called Thomas Hooper's Tavern. It was built in the mid 1700s, and it sat along Windsor Road, about 300 yards southeast of the Crossroads. And I'm going to go a few pages forward to show you exactly where. So it was somewhere within this lot, close to the bend of Windsor Road and a little bit south of the Crossroads. Now, this building was a convenient stop for travelers because it was a tavern at this Crossroads location. And it was the very building that hosted town meetings in Old Windsor Township in the mid 1700s. In fact, we have references to it in some of the early tavern licenses from the 1760s, mentioning that this is a convenient meeting spot for Windsor Township. Now, the tavern's owner was named Thomas Hooper, and his family had been in the Edinburg area since the 1740s when his father, Clement Hooper, bought several hundred acres of land. And Thomas himself has a very interesting but sad story. So during the Revolutionary War, many of his neighbors fought for George Washington's army. However, Thomas himself was apparently a British sympathizer, and this angered many of his neighbors. So he, seeing the writing on the wall, he traveled to Canada to look for a potential new home. However, while he was gone, several of his neighbors ransacked his house looking for him. And they, after finding that he was gone, they became very frustrated. And unfortunately, and it gets a little graphic, but they captured his wife, who was still recovering from childbirth. It's believed that the quote that's used is that she suffered cruel indignities at their hands. They probably unfortunately raped her and left her to die in an outhouse. Very soon after this, Thomas Hooper, his children, and about a dozen other families from New Jersey fled to Prince Edward Island, Canada, established a colony there, and never returned to New Jersey. So again, a very sad story. And after the Hoopers fled, their property was seized by the government and auctioned off. This was a practice commonly employed against loyalists during and after the American Revolution by the colonial government. Ironically, one of the late owners of Hooper's Old Tavern in the 1790s was a man named Martin Hoagland, who was a former captain in the American Army. Now, Martin himself had led a company of 45 men during the Battle of Princeton, and only 9 of which survived. And again, this map shows exactly where Hooper's Tavern lot was. So if anyone in the audience happens to be living in one of those properties, you can check your backyard to see if there's an old stone foundation buried underneath. And if you do happen to find one, then it might be the tavern. So, please let us know. Now, obviously, there is an Edinburg Hotel today. Now, Thomas Hooper's Tavern was probably demolished by the early 1800s and replaced by a different hotel directly at the Crossroads, which is not the current day Edinburg Hotel. Now, this second hotel, the one that directly replaced Thomas Hooper's Tavern, operated for many years. But there's some stories that have burned to the ground about 1895, and we don't know the exact cause as to why it would have done that. But what we do know is that it was replaced by a Victorian style building, which we now know as the Edinburg Hotel. This establishment, meaning the modern current day Edinburg Hotel, obviously provided food, drink, and accommodations for weary travelers at this stagecoach stop. And during the 1920s, it was a speakeasy and was raided by prohibition agents. And we have some newspaper articles about that as well. In the 1930s and 40s, it was a recreational hunting base. And eventually, it was turned into just a tavern without overnight accommodation, so effectively a restaurant of sorts. And then a few decades ago, it was fully converted into offices. So here is a picture of the Edinburg Hotel in 2022. And you can see some of its architecture has changed. Certainly its function has changed. Again, it's offices. And I don't know, but there might be apartments on the top. I'm not sure if that's true or not. But certainly it's not a tavern anymore. Certainly it's not a hotel anymore. So its function has certainly changed. That being said, it remains one of Edinburgh's, what I would qualify as the Crossroads' two most important historical landmarks around which the community kind of grew. So that begs the question, what is the other one of the most, historical landmarks? Well, it is this building, which most of us know as the Village Pantry. However, what you might not know is that it's also West Windsor's oldest operating storefront by a large margin. Now, this originally was a general store, and it was built around sometime between the years 1814 and 1816, so the 18 teens, by James Hutchinson, directly at the Crossroads. And now, in the olden days, general stores were essential for country villages like Edinburg, providing dry goods, food, and more. Around 1851, a post office opened in the building as well, and we think that it operated for about 55 to 60 years. So it shut down in probably around the year 1908 or so, give or take a few years. Now, in the 1930s, obviously, the hotel has passed through a number of owners over the years. I think the total number is about 21 or 22 since it was built. In the 1930s, Harry and Mary Hohenstein managed the store. Now, Harry delivered groceries to customers 3 times a week via horse and wagon. They also sold penny candy, bread, cupcakes, and other treats. So it's this stereotypical place where a kid could wander into, get some dessert. The parent can come in and get some dry goods. A stereotypical kind of general store. In 1936, Viola and Duke Stoltz bought the place, and I've read some things that said that Duke was blind, but apparently knew where everything was in the store. He could slice deli meat and count coins, but naturally relied on the honesty of customers when handling paper money. Now, in the rear of the store, at the time of their ownership, there was a game room with a pool table, and Duke and Viola also ran a chair caning shop. Now, pictured here is the store in 1938 with some locals hanging out on the stoop. And some of you, I'm sure, have already noticed the old gas pumps, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. Now, pictured here is Duke himself, the man riding in the wagon, probably around the 1940s, with some local children as well. Again, you can pay attention to these old Esso gas pumps. You might notice that these are not the same ones that exist there today. Instead, they're even older ones that predated the current ones. The original pumps were probably installed in the very early 1900s and replaced in the 1960s when the Tanner family bought the store. Now, in 1972, Ronald and Dorothy Mays bought the property and renamed the building the Village Pantry, which is the name that obviously still sticks around today. And this picture is probably from the 1980s. And you can notice the present day gas pumps right here in the lower left, the red and white ones. They still stand today. And although I think I've heard people say they probably stopped operating around the 1980s as well. And obviously, here's the Village Pantry today. Now, a few decades ago, the Lees began running the store. And under them and previous owners, the extension on the left, meaning this one, and there's a one-story addition that we can't see, had many other businesses over the past several decades as well. They're a little bit too numerous to mention in this lecture, except I'll point out what exists there today, which is the Greenhouse Graphics Printing Company. And I should also mention that the Lees very recently sold the property, literally this year. Obviously, we're hoping that the new owner is going to keep the village pantry preserved as one of West Windsor's key historic landmarks. Again, it's West Windsor's oldest operating storefront by an extremely large margin. It's one of its only, it's effectively its only remaining original general store of sorts, and it's significant in age and a key element of one of its historic communities. Now, if we go back to the early 1800s, I want to point out how, the properties had been divided by that point around the crossroads. So again, most of these major tracts that were several hundred acres each had been split amongst the descendants of the original settlers, as well as a number of new families. So here you can see how the crossroads were divided in the very early 1800s. So you can see a lot of concentration of the division is around the crossroads, because that's where most people obviously built their houses. Again, some of these families do still live nearby or in the area, including the Taylors, Tyndalls, Mounts, and Hutchinsons, and more. It was also in the mid 1800s, early to mid 1800s, that the community started to gradually change its name. Remember, the area was originally called Assunpink after the Creek and the local Native American tribe. However, by the 1820s, we began to see the name Edinburg start to appear. And we don't know for certain why the name changed. The only theory that I've ever read is that it was renamed to honor Edinburgh, Scotland, meaning the capital, Edinburgh, Scotland, the capital of Scotland, because that was supposedly the hometown of a popular local resident in Edinburg, West Windsor, New Jersey. So, we don't know if this is apocryphal or not. It could be urban legend. We just don't know. Whatever the reason, though, the name Edinburgh has obviously stuck around for the last 2 centuries. The area also saw a lot of industrial growth during the 1800s. At an early day, Daniel Howell reputedly had a blacksmith shop. David Hill carried on blacksmithing until about 1870, when he was succeeded by his son James. There were wheelwrights as well. And the last supposedly was a man named Frank Hill in about the 1870s or 1880s. These were people who repaired wheels for wagons. A man named Thomas Leonard established a foundry near the creek around 1810. And Ellison Carson also ran a grist mill, I believe, on the same property, a little bit north and west of the crossroads. In the mid 1800s, as I mentioned, Amos Tyndall owned a distillery and a cider mill. And other businesses included a broom factory, a cooper, a wheelwright shop, several shoemakers, a chair maker, a weaving shop, and 2 basket factories, which I'm going to highlight. Now, one of the basket factories is pictured here. This was operated by a man named Ebenezer Melvin Saley, standing in front of his basket shop on Old Trenton Road. And in fact, this is a picture I want to highlight because this was the old Saley home on Old Trenton Road, and it was demolished decades ago. But before it was torn down, it was supposedly the oldest house in West Windsor. However, although his old basket shop and his house were torn down long ago, another basket shop, the only other basket shop, still stands just north of the crossroads. So at 1337 Edinburg Road. A man named Absalom Hart probably built this house in the 1850s before he fought in the Civil War in the 1860s. Also in the 1860s, he made shoes. A map from 1860 exactly shows this as a shoemaker's establishment. But by the 1870s, he had turned this property into a basket weaving factory. And his basket weaving business at its height had about 5 employees, so it wasn't huge, but it was profitable, and it lasted until Absalom died in the early 1900s. Now, eventually, this property passed to the Carson family, including Al Carson, who was one of the co-founders of Lucar Hardware, who some of you might remember, which some of you might remember as being a hardware store by the train station that was shut down about 20 years ago. Now, Edinburgh also had a schoolhouse. Now, this building stood off of Old Trenton Road, around where the Edinburgh Animal Hospital is now. Back in 1800s era West Windsor, students up to grade 8, so grades 1 to 8, learned in several old one-room wooden buildings around town, just like this one. and most of them served a specific historic community. For example, there was a schoolhouse in Dutch Neck, there was a schoolhouse in Penn's Neck, there was a schoolhouse in Clarksville, and there was a schoolhouse in Edinburgh, and a few others as well. Now, specifically, this building, just like the other schoolhouses, was made obsolete in 1917 when Dutch Neck School and a long gone identical twin called Penn's Neck School, meaning the actual brick and stone buildings, were built. Eventually, the old schoolhouse, meaning the Edinburgh schoolhouse, passed to the Carlucci family, who I believe tore it down around the 1960s. Another building that no longer exists, but was torn down much more recently, was right at the Crossroads. This was a building that was probably built in the very early 1800s by a couple named James and Martha Hooper. In 1905, it passed through a number of families, and then in 1905, a man named Jacob Clayton bought the property and turned it into a dry goods and harness store. And I believe he also sold cigars as well. Now, we don't know exactly how long he ran it as a store, but in the 1940s, Joe and Madeline Taylor bought the house, fixed it up, and rented it out. One of the tenants was named Newton Mount, who moved in with his wife Florence Conover in the early 1960s and bought the place in the 1970s. Some of you might actually remember Newton. He was a steel worker. He served in the Korean War, and he passed away about 10 years ago, after which the township bought the property and they demolished it in 2018. And 2 years ago, turned the half of the land into a right turn lane. Now, this is one of my favorite photos. It's from around the year 1920. The two men in the center, obviously, are standing where Old Trenton Road curves into Windsor Road. On the left is John H. Tyndall, a local carpenter, tanner. Sorry, a carpenter and tanner, and again, member of one of West Windsor's oldest families. And on the right is Russell Clayton, who I believe was the son of Jacob Clayton, who again owned the dry goods store behind where they're standing. So again, you can see that store. You can see the unpaved dirt road. You can see the Edinburgh Hotel on the right. And what's notable here is also the gas pump on the corner of the Edinburgh Hotel. So it wasn't just the general store, meaning the village pantry, that had a gas pump. There was also one where the hotel is. You can also see this old car here. And finally, you see this house on the very, very left, which still stands. In fact, that house is this blue house right here on the right. Now, the blue house and the white house next to it were historically both Tyndall family houses. The White House is much older, and both of them are very near to the crossroads. Well, they're at the crossroads, basically. The White House is much older, and its very oldest portion may date to the mid-1800s. That's where John H. Tyndall, again, this man, and his wife Anna lived, and they raised several children here, including George Washington Tyndall, who lived on the house on the right with his wife Gertrude. Although the blue house has since passed to other owners and passed out of the family, the White House on the left is still kept in the Tyndall family and in the descendant line of John H. Tyndall. So here's a few family members of the old Tyndall family on the left, sitting on the front porch of that White House. From left to right, they are Anna Tyndall, John H. Tyndall, John's father, John, also named John, and I believe another man named Daniel Hutchinson. And if you look closely, you also see a cat kind of where their feet are. And on the right, you have George Washington Tyndall, who again was the son of Anna Tyndall and John H. Tyndall. And George Washington Tyndall is sitting on his front porch of the blue house on the right. So there's a few other crossroads houses to point out. On the left is what we call the Rachel Conover house. It was built around the year 1900, directly next to the general store. It was apparently popular with door-to-door salesmen as a boarding home. And the house caught fire in 1942, and most of it burned down. So we don't know how much of the building is still original, but I did want to highlight it. However, a house that is very much original is this one on the right, what we're calling the Foreman Conover Taylor house. Again, our naming convention is typically which families have lived in a house for a significant period of time, or which families have relatively, historical significance in general. It was probably built around the 1830s or 1840s, and it was owned by the Formans through much of the 1800s. Now, a man named Norman Conover bought the house around the year 1930, which is about the same time that he founded a lumber yard called Conover and Emmons near the train station. Now, Norman died in 1940, and his wife, Madeline, remarried a man named Joseph Taylor. And I think, but I'm not sure, that the house still remains in Taylor hands to this day. Now, some other houses near the crossroad as we go further out. The one on the very left is on a small hill. You might recognize it at the intersection of Robbinsville Road and Old Trenton Road. And this was probably built in the mid to late 1800s. There was a foundry near the house in the mid 1800s, again operated by Thomas Leonard. In the center, this one here at 1309 Windsor Road, is what we're calling the Joseph Mount House, after an early owner in the early 1800s, and it's located directly at the bend in Windsor Road. It seems to have been built in the early 1800s or earlier, again. And across the road, so this house on the very right, is the Clayton Conover house, which tax records say was built around 1920. Now, we're still doing more research into each of, especially the two houses on the right, and we're going to certainly give updates on social media and on our website as we find out more. Now, as we get further into the 20th century, so we're entering the 1900s, I want to reiterate that farming remained uniquely dominant in Edinburgh for generations. And it wasn't really until the 1960s and beyond that we start to see much of the broader landscape begin to change with the advent of local parks, suburbs, and colleges. But back in the mid 20th century, so the mid 1900s, farming was still king. Many farms employed migrant laborers. So these were people who lived and worked here during the growing and harvesting seasons and typically returned south to more southern states during the colder months. And again, many of them worked for some of those old families I previously mentioned, such again, the Tyndalls, the Hutchinsons, the Rogers, and more families. Now, pictured here is another interesting photo. This is a man named Russell Tyndall, who's transporting a heap of hay off of his farm in Old Trenton Road. This was the farm that I previously called the Amos Tyndall farm, which again was eventually passed down through generations to one of his descendants, Earl Tyndall. Now, I don't know exactly when this picture was taken, but I assume it was the early to mid 20th century. Again, this landscape where you can see farmland stretching to the distance was the typical landscape surrounding Edinburgh for many years. Again, one of endless farm fields stretching to the horizon in every direction. And here's another photo. I could be wrong about this, so if someone can correct me, that's perfectly fine. But I believe this is the Elgrum farm, presumably in the mid 1900s. If so, then it stood off of Old Trenton Road and South Post Road for many years. And of course, this was well before my time, and it was demolished many decades ago, probably about the time that Mercer County Park was built. Here's another one of my favorite photos, which we used to advertise this lecture, and it was at the very beginning of the lecture as well. This is from 1962. It was taken by a relatively prominent Princeton photographer at the time named Howard Schaefer. We're standing on Old Trenton Road looking east. So this is the intersection of Old Trenton Road is the big road going through most of the picture, and we have Edinburgh on the left, next to the village pantry. To our extreme left is Newton Mount's store. Newton Mount's house, which again used to be the Jacob Clayton store in the early 1900s. In the center, obviously, you have the general store called the Village Pantry. On the very right, you have the Edinburgh Hotel. You notice again the old Esso sign in the gas pumps, and you might notice thought I could zoom in. You might notice a telephone booth right, kind of smack dab in the center of the general store, just to the right of the directional street sign. Now, if I go further, I want to talk a little bit about postal routes, because that was an important element of mid-century Edinburgh. Now, zip codes were formally created by the U.S. Parcel Service, or the USPS, in 1963. And again, I mentioned that Edinburgh had a post office, but that shut down about the year 1908 or so. So we're several decades more recent now. Now, pictured is a map from around the same time, meaning around 1963, 1964, showing West Windsor's postal routes. And you might notice there's, I believe, 10 of them at the time. Names like Cranberry, Dutch Neck, Heightstown, Princeton Rural, Princeton City, Star Route, and a few others. In the Edinburgh area specifically, you see names like Trenton, Robbinsville, and Heightstown being highlighted. And this added to an extra sense of identity for local residents, because oftentimes residents would more often closely identify with these postal routes or Edinburgh in general as their main sense of place and sense of neighborhood, rather than identifying with West Windsor Township as a whole. And this wasn't unique to Edinburgh. Villages like Dutch Neck, people who lived in Princeton Junction, people who lived in Clarksville, they much more closely identified with either their immediate village or their immediate postal route than they would with the West Windsor Township. And so someone, living in the Trenton, along the Trenton, the green postal route might have literally said they lived in Trenton before before they said they lived in West Windsor. Someone along the Heightstown route might have said they lived in Heightstown, even though they lived in West Windsor. And it wasn't really until the 20th century when suburban development began to fill in the farmland between the different historic neighborhoods that the overall township began to supersede Edinburgh and these postal routes as their primary sense of place. And in 1998, I believe, around that year, give or take a year, I believe by that year there were about 7 postal routes, but in 1998, a lot of them consolidated into the 2 zip codes we know today, which are 08550 and 08540. So the zip codes have had a lot of impact on where people think they live. Even today, people who live in the 08540 zip code, even if they live in West Windsor's borders, their address is often going to say Princeton, even though they're not located in Princeton municipality. So there's still that extra sense of identity and some confusion today as well as to where West Windsor begins and other townships end. Another thing to point out in the broader landscape is a lot of change that came in the 1970s, especially when Mercer County Park was built. So again, in the 1970s, Mercer County bought thousands of acres of farmland in the area, demolished a lot of the old farmhouses. They dammed the Assunpink Creek, creating the lake, and then they established Mercer County Park around it about the same time. Now, an interesting thing, we have newspaper articles from around the time the park was being planned and developed. And one of those old newspaper articles actually even mentions there being plans for a zoo to be within the park. So obviously that never came to fruition, but it would have been interesting to see. Today, obviously, the park is a regionally popular attraction, and the lake is often used by Olympic level rowers. Another big change nearby came when 2 higher education institutions opened. So in 1972, we have Mercer County Community College opening, a $22 million, 300-acre campus on Old Trenton Road. And around the same time, the Mercer County Vocational School, which is some of you might better known as VOTEC, opened its doors just across the road to about 550 students. And both of these institutions still operate and obviously have changed the kind of more general and more distant landscape around Edinburgh since they were built. Now, I've neglected to talk a lot about Windsor Road and some of the other houses on Old Trenton Road. Again, part of this is due to time constraints, but again, we have a questions and answer session at the end. Probably one of the best remembered farms on Windsor Road was Windsor Farm and Garden, just at West Windsor's border with Robbinsville. So this is at 1202. It should say 1202 Windsor Road, so that's a typo right there. I personally remember the Halloween festivals every year, including this, huge 3-foot a talking pumpkin, a petting zoo, and hay wagon rides. I'm sure a lot of you remember that as well. I believe they had car shows as well and a few other things. It was their agritainment kind of management of the property. I was sad to see it shut down a few years ago, but obviously things happen for a reason. And that land, and frankly, most of the rest of Windsor Road is still farmed, which I'm happy to see. Now, of course, one of West Windsor's big historical themes has been the loss of its farmland over the past several decades. Now, in the rest of town, this was mainly due to suburban and commercial development. However, around the Edinburgh area, it wasn't so much due to commercial development, even though there obviously were some developments you can see scattered around. Largely, it was mostly because of the development of Mercer County Park and the colleges that caused most of the change to the landscape itself. In fact, even to this day, Edinburgh has the highest proportion of farmland, including preserved farmland, when compared to almost all the rest of town, although there's obviously much less farmland than there used to be. A lot of the reason that the farmland is still around is due to preservation efforts by the township, by a local nonprofit called the Friends of West Windsor Open Space. I encourage you to join them and support them, of course, and by the local farmers themselves. And I know it's obviously getting increasingly difficult and more expensive to manage a farm, but for now, at least, the farmland remains. Here's a view, a drone shot that I took a few weeks ago along Old Trenton Road. And the big farm in the center is the Tyndall Farm across the road from the Mercer County Community College. Now, if we return to Edinburg, I kind of want to ask the rhetorical question, where does Edinburg stand today? Well, it's in a unique position. A lot of the farmland was converted into parks and suburbs long ago, but a decent portion of that farmland still remains along Old Trenton Road, along Windsor Road, especially as well. A lot of the historic structures in the larger surrounding landscape were torn down over the years, especially when the park was built, especially when the college was built, especially when some other suburban developments were built, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and more recently. But there are still a few dozen actually in the surrounding landscape, including especially along, again, Old Trenton Road and Windsor Road. And specifically at the Crossroads, which we see here, there were some houses that were demolished in recent decades, but a good proportion of the original structures do remain. Partly because Edinburg, as a crossroads hamlet, was never huge to begin with. It never had 50 buildings. It was always maybe a dozen to maybe a dozen and a half buildings at most. So the 9 that do remain that you can see in this picture are significant proportion of the original buildings. But despite its small size, the Crossroads is very still much a historic place. So, don't let the fact that it has 9 buildings fool you into thinking that it doesn't mean something. Still, obviously, traffic often clogs the intersection, and trucks from warehouses are becoming increasingly common. And in more recent years, I know that there's been at least one of them crashing into the Edinburg Hotel was rebuilt, but I don't know, if that's an anomaly or if it's happened more than once in the past. Edinburgh's historic buildings are also increasingly at risk. But the biggest one being if Mercer County ever decides to widen Old Trenton Road, which would necessitate, the demolition or moving of several of the houses. However, there is still hope. One way to make sure Edinburg remains preserved well into the future, if any of you live in Edinburg, is to list some of your properties or even the whole village on the state and national registers of historic places, which I understand is obviously a big lift, but it's probably the most solid way to make sure it remains preserved. And I do think that a number of the local houses certainly qualify for the state and national register. Another is, again, by volunteering for the Historical Society in helping us educate and advocate for preservation of Edinburg and preservation in West Windsor in general. And it obviously takes a village to save a village, and this is certainly a village with a history worth saving. So now we come to the very last slide, and this is it for the presentation. So I want to thank everyone for your time. Again, here's some relevant links. At the top is if anyone wants more info about Edinburg, even beyond what I was talking about, the website actually has the most information, including detailed histories of every single building at the Crossroads. It goes into more detail than what I was able to do tonight. The second link is if you want to volunteer or donate, which again would be huge helps. We're a small nonprofit. We're fully volunteers, so we're always inviting more volunteers. And the bottom link directs to the more info about our Westminster history book. So with that, I want to say thanks again, and I'm happy to take any questions. You can feel free to put them into the chat, or feel free. We're a small enough group that you can feel free to unmute if you want as well. So thank you. Now, there was one question, what crops were grown typically, from Peter. It kind of depends on the decade. I believe today there's a lot of corn grown locally. Certainly in the 1700s, there was a lot of grains that were grown. It's hard to tell what there was in the 1800s, but I can say in the 1700s, there was a lot of wheat, there was a lot of rye generally, and there were certainly peach orchards as well, and apple orchards, and a lot of fruit orchards. In fact, the John Rogers house, which I talked about closer to the beginning of the lecture, the one that's on the National Register, supposedly had over 1,000 peach trees before Mercer County acquired the property. And then obviously when they built the park, the orchard was no longer kept. Just so you know, everyone knows also this lecture has been recorded, and I'm sure all of you noticed that. So we'll be posting it to YouTube as well, so people who couldn't attend can watch it. Then from Catherine, did you mention the population? I'm not quite sure what that question means. In terms of how many people lived in Edinburgh, kind of depends. It depends on how you define and delineate in Edinburgh. If it's the immediate crossroads, any one time you might have had several dozen people living there. You had a number of families, but if it's just the crossroads, you have several dozen people. If you had also included the surrounding landscape, it was maybe a few hundred. Okay. And thank you for the kind words. So, if there's no other, feel free to enter other questions, but if there's no other questions, then I want to thank everyone else for coming. We're going to do more lectures, of course, during 2025. We're going to start, I think, pretty much immediately, either in January or February, depending on how we consolidate our calendar of events. And obviously, we're going to have more events in person as the weather gets warmer as well. So look forward to a whole calendar of events. So thank you all again very much.